Good afternoon and welcome to Book Sandwiched In. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Rebecca Harrison and I'm the manager of adult services here at Central Library. I'm very excited to be helping out this spring by introducing our wonderful lineup of speakers. A big thank you to the Friends of the Tulsa City-County Libraries for sponsoring today's program. If you'd like more information about how to become a friend of the library, visit tulsalibrary.org/friends. If you have any questions throughout today's program, please feel free to put those in the chat. Our speaker will be answering audience questions following his presentation. And now I'd like to welcome today's presenter, Michael Brose. Michael was born in Liberal, Kansas, and attended Oral Roberts University in Tulsa, where he earned his bachelor's degree in social work in 1979. He attended the University of Kansas and graduated with an MSW in social work in 1980 before returning to Tulsa, where he and his wife, Marin, have made their home since. Mike has worked extensively with individuals living with serious mental illness and their families. He has also worked in juvenile justice, medical social work, and geriatric mental health care. He served as the director of family therapy at St. John Medical Center from 1987 to 1992. He became the director of the Mental Health Association of Oklahoma in 1993 and served as the CEO there for 27 years, overseeing growth from 5 employees to almost 200 as a statewide organization. He currently practices privately with individuals and families, consults and volunteers in the community and across the state. Please join me in warmly welcoming Michael.
Hey, thanks, Rebecca. I really appreciate that. Uh-oh, we got an echo going there. Is that better? Okay. This is a great honor to be asked. I think it's important for me to give you a little more information to sort of put the review of this in context. First of all, I've given many presentations on mental health related topics and subjects over these years. This is my first book review, so there's a first time for everything. So bear with me, and I've really enjoyed it. So this book, titled Hidden Valley Road: Inside the Mind of an American Family by Robert Kolker, and you may have read his award-winning book Lost Girls. I have not, but after reading this book, I'm certainly interested in more of Mr. Kolker's work. He lives in New York City, and he works for New York Magazine, Bloomberg Business Week, and lives in Brooklyn with his family. And I just admire people who can write and research like this and put all this type of research together. It's truly amazing, and then turn it into a very readable, accessible book. But again, before I get into the book itself, I wanted to just talk to you a little bit about my work and career for the last 40 years as a practicing social worker has been working with individuals affected by serious mental illness. And a lot of times that's code. Usually when we use serious mental illness, we're talking about schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, major depression, obsessive compulsive disorder, schizoaffective disorder. Usually those are the ones in that category. Sometimes that's kind of code a little bit in terms of the term serious mental illnesses. And so I've been, particularly in my career, very, and remain so to this very day, very fascinated in the whole idea about the diagnosis and mental illness of schizophrenia, which is such a prominent diagnosis in Hidden Valley Road. I've been trying to study it, read about it, understand it. It's real interesting how the knowledge and the understanding and the interpretation of this particular diagnosis of schizophrenia that affects about 1 to 2 million people in this country, about 20 million or so worldwide. But it's a devastating illness. Some of you on here may be on here because it has affected you or your families and want to know more about it. And Hidden Valley Road, of course, the title is the name of the street. The story is about a family that lived, raised their family in Colorado Springs, and the cul-de-sac or the road they lived on was called Hidden Valley Road in this home that they lived in, and which bears the name of the title. And so it spans the period of time, though, that it spans is right out of almost 100 years. And it goes back into, again, when you talk about mental health and you talk about histories of mental illness, one thing that mental health professionals and clinicians are always interested in is family of origin, the family history. And a lot of times when we do social histories, we'll ask people, are you aware of anybody else in your family who might have had this illness? And you'll see, this is again, my experience. You'll see individuals or families will say, well, we had an uncle who we don't know exactly, but there are a lot of similarities. Or a lot of times with bipolar disorder, you'll see a very direct hereditary connection. Very common, somebody will say, well, my dad had it, or my mom, or had bipolar disorder. But with schizophrenia, while we've long suspected that there was a genetic connection, you wouldn't see it like that. It would kind of bounce around and it would disappear. But it wasn't, and a lot of times families it bounces around and disappears for literally generations, multiple generations, and it reappears. And a lot of times families just don't have all that information because of the loss of that information over time, death, changes, geographic change. This particular story is, again, from Janet Henderson. I want to give her a lot of credit. She contacted me several months ago about this and told me a little bit about it and asked me if I'd be interested. And again, it coincides with my interest about schizophrenia, in particular schizophrenia. And because in my job as the chief CEO of Mental Health Association Oklahoma, have consulted with hundreds of individuals and families who have loved ones who are they themselves or a family member directly affected by schizophrenia. And if you're not familiar or you've not been affected, I can only say that the impact on a family it's absolutely can be devastating. And so the book, in spanning the really beyond 100 years, because it really goes back to really talking about Freud and Freud's work with people with schizophrenia, and Carl Jung, his colleague, and Freud was, of course, a mentor. They were colleagues, and they actually had a real split over some of this information related to this and a lot of other things, theoretical. And of course, Freud, if you remember, psychoanalysis was his modus operandi of talking to people on couch, talking therapy, and talking therapy really comes out of that. And in his conceptualization that this illness was caused by these unconscious forces working in different ways, and through analysis that people could be healed or cured, even of schizophrenia. And so that was, for a long time, that was a part of the deal. And again, Kolker, in the book, brilliantly, he overlays the story of the Galvin family. And the Galvin family was a classic. Don Galvin went into the Navy and World War II, and was he and his wife Mimi. They were married very young, And right before he shipped out, of course, that was going on at that time in World War II. That was a very common occurrence. And when he left her pregnant, and with their first child, Donald, and went off. And Don himself, a part of the story is, again, that the trauma and the impact of the illness of this family was just unbelievable. It's just, you just can't even comprehend it. And but Don, the dad, the patriarch of this family, he experienced a lot in World War II. And again, many of you know, many of the returning veterans from World War II, that generation came back and did not talk about what they had seen and what they had experienced. And so many of them suffered from what we would now call post-traumatic stress disorder. In those days, a lot of times the term they used was, some of you are familiar, shell-shocked. But now we know, we have a lot more science around it, treatable. Of course, out of the Vietnam War, the Afghanistan, Iraqi wars, post-traumatic stress disorder, you can walk up to somebody on the street, as you know, and say PTSD, and they have a good idea exactly what you're talking about. So, and so Don himself, the patriarch, came back. They got their family. Then he was in the military. He really wanted the Navy to elevate him to and really send him to law school, which they rejected him, I think, at least 4 times. And so finally, they continued to have children, but eventually he left the Navy out of frustration. And then it was interesting, the Air Force was just beginning to be a service branch. I don't think I realized that the Air Force was relatively that new of a branch of the military. I don't know, you guys may know that, but I did not know that, that it didn't really come together as to be, I think it was the Air Army, but then it branched off and became the Air Force, which is one of the most fascinating things in this book, was that Don Galvin, well, I got to get ahead of myself. Don Galvin he was recruited and re-enlisted into the Air Force, and they said, if you'll come in and re-enlist, this is like he'd been out of the Navy for, I kind of forget now, 6 or 7 years, while they were beginning their family back east, and he was doing just fine, consulting, doing things, and but anyway, he joined up, and then the Air Force created their headquarters in Colorado Springs, which is why how the family ended up there in Colorado Springs. And Don and his wife, excuse me, I'm having a little trouble with my allergies. Don and his wife, it really portrays in the book, they became avid falconers and very, very talented and skilled, and taught many others in their classes, taught their children how to be falconers. This, art of practice of kings and rulers all over the world, where falconing is really practiced and learned. And he learned how to do that and became highly skilled. And interesting, if you're familiar, the Air Force Academy, their mascot is the falcon. And who suggested that name? Don Galvin. Don Galvin and his wife Mimi, she kind of took credit later on, but giving him the idea. But he is credited for creating the name of the Air Force Academy Falcons. But anyway, they began to have children, and Don was a Catholic, Mimi converted to Catholicism, and they began to have children, and eventually they had 12 children. The first 10 were boys, and they were a dynamic family in the community, very athletic, very well known. The kids were, Donald, the first oldest, was very well known in Colorado, as a outstanding football player, wrestler, and they raised this family. And then in late teens, early 20s, Donald, the firstborn, began to manifest symptoms that were later diagnosed as schizophrenia. And again, it's interesting, one of the fascinating questions that's been throughout my career is, Why is it that while there are exceptions, schizophrenia manifests itself in late teens and early 20s? If you ask that question to any family member or mental health professional, they'll tell you late teens, early 20s. There always are exceptions, but by far the rule. And so that was what it began to have. And so they eventually had 10 children, or 12 children, excuse me, 10 boys and 2 girls. The last 2 born were the girls, the first 10. And you can imagine this family there were stories written about them in the local newspapers there. They had stories about them in the Denver Post. Very fascinating. When they finally had Mimi had a girl, that made the news. All kinds of things about this family. And of course, Don grew to become a very prominent figure in the development of Colorado and the western states. And he was very instrumental, highly known, all out west, Utah, Wyoming, Montana, Colorado, New Mexico. He was a very, very prominent figure in the development, in the culture, the development of culture, the ballet, all kinds of things in that part of the country. And he was a leader and a facilitator, and he consulted with generals, he consulted with governors, he had contacts in Washington, D.C., he traveled all over the country, met with people, and was sought after as someone you've got to talk to. If you're going to try to do something here, you want to drill for oil on this property over here, you need to talk to Don Galvin. And he was a very, very prominent figure. And Mimi, his wife, was home raising the children, very traditional family. But so Donald became mentally ill with schizophrenia. And then the book goes all the way through. And in the end, it was that 6 of the 10 boys in this family developed symptoms unique. Each one of them had their own unique characteristics and symptoms, but all of them clearly had schizophrenia eventually. You can only imagine this. I mean, I have never in my entire practice, I've worked and talked to many, many families over the years. I was trying to wrap my brain. I couldn't think of one family that I've ever worked with that they had 2 siblings in the same family with schizophrenia. I never actually gave it much thought. I didn't even really think about it. I just never came across it. But obviously, and through the book and the research, it is common. Although their family, they estimated, if I've got this right, that some of the statistical of this happening in a family, these number of children who developed schizophrenia was like 1 in 9 billion. I actually thought that sounded a bit low, but someone had actually done some work on that to try to come up with some kind of measurement on the frequency in the population, and 1 in 1.9 billion. So gives you an idea how incredibly rare it was. But they, over time, began to the word got around about them in the different treatment communities there, and they began to be known. And all of this coincided with the development of the National Institute of Mental Health, NIMH, in Washington, D.C. It's a federally funded that does research and training around all things mental illness, mental health related. I've referred many, many times people to go to the NIMH website because I know that's a trusted website to get information. So some of the country's most prominent researchers operate out of NIMH. So Kolker, when he wrote the book, it tells the story in amazing detail. And it was the younger daughter, Lindsay, who eventually was able to help get, I kept wondering, how did they get all this medical psychiatric information? I have a colleague over in Oklahoma City, Joe Hyde, who wrote a book about his brother who was a priest. And he had terrible time getting any information to help him write that book about his brother, his psychiatric information. But somehow they were able to get this, and they gave that somewhere along the line. That went to Robert Kolker, and he organized all that in this brilliantly in this book and lays out this. So it reads like almost like a novel or a story about this family. But interlaid in there was the history of the treatment and the belief about how schizophrenia and this family, and it really lined up with my career. And one of the things they talk about at length was when I first came into the field in 1980, 78, 80, right in there, we were told in school that there was a thing known as the schizophrenic mother. And it was taught to me as fact. And the idea behind it was that the mothers were basically, and this is very simplified, is that mothers, in particular mothers, and again it was interesting, somehow dads were left out of this, but they always talked about the schizophrenic mother, that they would give their children mixed messages. And they would be saying, do this, no, don't do that, do this. And they would give these messages. This was the theory, the hypothesis, that they would give them these mixed messages, and they would put the child in what was known as, in those days, we were taught, a double bind, in the double bind theory. And so the child, to resolve this mixed messages on the same subject from the parent, like I'm trying to think of an example, very simplified, like you need to be good and behave yourself, and by the way, go out and have a lot of fun and be creative, and if you get in a fight, we understand. That's a very simplified, it was much more subtle than that. But the theory was that the child, and their inability to resolve these double bind messages, that they would retreat into a psychotic state of mind. And this was taught. And Gregory Bateson, Margaret Mead's husband, who the book points out had no real training, wrote a book called The Steps to an Ecology of Mind, which is a fascinating read. It was people, I knew people when I first got in graduate school, they just carried it around with them. And a lot of this was taught and came out of, it was very much widely interpreted. I even heard a debate in Washington, D.C. around 1987, this school of thought against what began to emerge was that there was really a biological basis, that the double bind theory, the schizophrenic mother, was untrue and could not be substantiated by science. And the book, and Kolker really goes into that. And I think that's really important because so many mothers with children who have schizophrenia, and you'll notice that I don't use the term schizophrenic. This is my mental health association. We always at Mental Health Association, we didn't like that term to say someone was a schizophrenic. And in the same way, we wouldn't say somebody is a heart attack or they're a cancer. And we were always very sensitive about that. We liked people first language, a person with, or a people with, or a person affected by, to remember they are a person first and foremost. We call that people first language. But and so I use that at all. I'm really quoting out of the book. It is used somewhat in the book, but and by professionals. And I've heard many professionals use that. And we at Mental Health Association, advocacy organization, we never really cared for that. And we always tried to teach people about people first language. But he goes through that in all the history, and I could just read, and it just followed along with my career, because I believe that. And then as the science progressed, PET scans, CT scans, MRIs, other types of research that he goes into great lengths, geneticists got involved. People who were neurophysiologists got involved in this research. NIMH, I mentioned earlier, National Institute of Mental Health, they funded a lot of this. This is going on. People wanted to know. And it began to shift over away from that this could be cured or treated by talking therapy. Certainly talking therapy can enhance things and can be helpful, but it's not caused by the schizophrenic mother. The double-bind theory has been debunked, and I don't really know anybody. I mean, I've talked to my students now. I teach social work classes out at Oral Roberts University now, and I've been a field instructor for many years. We don't even talk about that unless there's some reason to bring that up and put some historical context on it. And by the way, this book, this will become recommended reading for some of my students and interns going forward. It is not only a fabulous story and a fabulous read, it's also very, for mental health professionals, it's extremely passing on incredible historical information on the history, but brings it forward. And then the book eventually gets heavily into all the genetic work that's going on, and things they still are trying to pin down. They originally wanted one gene and thought we can find that one gene. And of course, with the Human Genome Project and some of that work, we now know that schizophrenia, from all the evidence, it looks like it has a genetic basis, but it's very complex. They have been able to identify some genes that are highly suspect or big contributors. It talks about those in the book. In all honesty, it gets technical, although Kolker does a great job of keeping that information accessible to the layperson or to the non-professional. Again, when you get into genetics, I'm not trained in that. I have no background in that. That's beyond me. But I was still able to learn things that I did not know and be able to access that information. And I think the common everyday reader of the book can also learn from that. And it is highly traumatic. I would put a cautionary note. If you are a family member or you yourself, have schizophrenia, live with schizophrenia and recovery with schizophrenia, I would make sure that that just to be careful. The trauma, it can be. There was so much trauma in this family. It was unbelievable. And by the way, it was documented eventually that the two young girls were molested by one of the brothers who had schizophrenia. Both of them sexually molested. That all came out, and also it came out very late. They discovered that when they covered the detail early in the book about there was a priest there in the Colorado Springs area. And the way they went to great lengths to talk about him being at their home, doing things with their boys when they were growing up. He was a trusted priest in their community. They all loved him. He was at their house all the time. And boy, I thought, oh no. And then it kind of dropped that. This priest, by name, they called him Father Freudy. He disappeared. And then right towards the end of the book, he reappears. It comes out that, unfortunately, as many of you know, the discovery of the frequency and the commonality all over the world of priests molesting children. And I hate to bring that up. I hope, hey, I'm not Catholic, but I have great respect for the Catholic Church, and I have many, many Catholic friends. And I worked for a Catholic institution for 5.5 years, and I loved every second of it and had wonderful experiences. But the truth is, the fact of the matter is that this has occurred, and the oldest boy, Donald, was molested repeatedly by this priest that the family trusted, and it was just a shock to the parents. And eventually, I think one of the most interesting parts of the story is the parents, particularly the mother, Mimi. What a woman. what a tower of strength. Like all of us, she had her faults. Don, what a, it was the classic family, the out there in the world, making a name for himself and bringing in money. They never were wealthy. They never made a lot of money. Mimi at home, who came from a wealthy family, um, um, just doing everything she could. And eventually, at one time, she cared for. Don had had a stroke, was disabled. She took care of him. She took care of four of the boys at home at the same time. One of the sons died in a murder-suicide and killed his wife and killed himself. And there is a lot of trauma. So that's why I just want to say, be careful if you've experienced a lot of trauma. This book can bring up a lot of trauma for you, and that can be, you might want to talk to your therapist or your clinician, or you might want to, be careful as you move forward. You may want to put the book down and not try to, because it can be almost overwhelming. I felt like it's dark at times, although it also breeds hope for the future. And in the end, it gets that really we're on the cusp of breakthroughs on the treatment of this illness. And one thing it doesn't talk about is what's known as ignosignosia. And I talk a lot about this. I make sure all my students understand it. Ignosignosia comes out of biology, which means the lack of insight that they're ill. And that was one of the things about schizophrenia, particularly untreated. And again, schizophrenia is treatable, but see, the deal is it's been basically since the 1950s, Thorazine and its derivatives and very similar medication. They're known as typicals, and then there's the atypical clozaril, clozapine. And one of the sons really got better on clozaril. Really, it was very positive. We know a lot of stories. He even talks about feeling like he like had an awakening, and it's been described as that. There's been stories written about that, and it touches on. This book is like a tour de force in the history and treatment of schizophrenia and the research. And I just want to mention, some of you may know this, some of you may not, the Warren family here in Tulsa, Oklahoma, they have invested millions and millions of dollars in the development of the Laureate Institute for Brain Research. And world-class brain research, a lot of it around schizophrenia, major depression, PTSD, all kinds of different brain disorders being done right here in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and doing amazing work. And by the way, if you're interested in participating in those studies, or you know someone is, I used to refer my students, because if they got accepted in a study, they could make $20 an hour to do that. And several of them did that. And I went out there as a part of a demonstration and had my brain scanned, and my wife keeps a picture of my brain on a disc. And anyway, but I really credit the Warren family here in town, who have invested millions on, and the return on that may be years, decades away. We don't really know, but they are making progress on this to not only treat it more effectively, but to prevent it. And there talks about in the book, there is out of the research, there is a nutrient that was present in prenatal vitamins, but because of this research, they really did a lot of work. FDA, NIMH got involved, and the amount of that particular nutrient has been increased dramatically in prescribed prenatal vitamins. And they have really strong evidence that it has preventative qualities. They've been able to demonstrate that, and that's really that's been one of the huge breakthroughs. But there is more on the horizon, and part 2 of this book is yet to be written because of that, because it ends and the story is continuing to evolve and be told. And just the researchers that been involved, they're all named. Kolker did an amazing job. I can't comprehend the amount of research that required him, but he still keeps the book interesting. So I'll stop there and open it up, Rebecca.
All All right. Thank you so much. This book sounds fascinating. I actually have a sibling with schizophrenia, so a lot of this really resonated for me. So, our first question is, can you talk a bit about the primary indicators for diagnosing schizophrenia?
Yeah, I think it's asking about symptoms. And yeah, I mean, very common. We talk about delusions. Now, again, I know a lot of people with schizophrenia who are in treatment. They work with their doctor. They tweak and manage their medications, and they live very good lives. However, these medications are very powerful. They have a lot of side effects, and that's one of the problems. But untreated delusions, paranoia. Um, Again, I mentioned agnosia, not talked about by that name, but completely they're in their minds, they're in the same reality that we are in right now. And that's one of the hardest things because people are family members and people are trying to get them treatment and they don't think there's anything wrong with them. A lot of times, and they talked about this, and there are a lot of times delusions about being in the CIA or someone from the CIA following them, lots of religious themes. Those are talked about extensively. The Galvin boys, all of them at different points in time in different ways, experience a lot of these delusions and symptoms. But those are very common ones. Lack of contact with reality, psychosis, depression, delusions, paranoia. Those are some of the very common hearing voices. Hearing voices very common.
Okay. Do you know if the supplemental therapy for babies and young children has been implemented beyond the study that was begun by one of the scientists mentioned in the book?
I'm talking about the nutrient I was mentioning.
They say
Oh,
supplement therapy.
I don't know. Well, if I'm not sure what they're talking about there, but there are a lot of different avenues for treatment. A lot of though the treatment, the day-to-day treatment that's going on, is really not that much different than the treatment that was going on when I came into the field 40 years ago. Other than some of the medications have been tweaked, but as a book referenced several times, they're still being treated primarily with derivatives in some way, shape, or form in the classification of thoracine. We refer to these as antipsychotics, either typical antipsychotics or atypical antipsychotics. But, all kinds of different things come out in terms of different ways, vitamin therapies, all kinds of things. But again, this book really tries to tie closely to the science, and there's just lots of things out there. Yeah.
As far as, for folks who aren't well versed in the science, do you think this book is pretty approachable and accessible for those people?
I definitely do. I mentioned that earlier. I think Kolker does an amazing job of keeping it accessible to the layperson, and which I think was a statement. I mean, Lost Girls. I didn't read that. Probably you guys have. Some of you have, but it makes me want to go get it and read it because he's really very gifted writer in trying to keep a very complex topic, and how he organizes the book and the time he spends. You really feel like you get to know each one of these members of this family. He does not gloss over it. Actually, the book is mostly about the individuals and their stories. It's really the science. He kind of weaves it around through it and kind of tries to time it with what was going on with where they were in their own family timeline, and just brilliantly organized in that way. But it's very accessible.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like a big topic to like condense into a book that is accessible. So he must be a very gifted writer. Another question from the chat: as the sibling of a brother with intellectual disabilities and schizophrenia, I appreciated the perspective of how mental illness impacts the family dynamics and life for every single family member. I heavily identified with the sisters in this book. Have you done much work with siblings of people with mental health issues?
Yes. Of course, I always had a family systems perspective. I was really raised and trained, and I still do. Looking at and seeing So many times the researchers here, they have to be very focused in on what's going on inside the skin of that person. But I was always in my role as a provider, a treatment provider, my perspective was yes, the person has a illness or is affected by a developmental disability, mental illness, whatever, but the whole family is impacted in all kinds of ways. And my job was to help the whole family to and I think you see and hear in the book that the family became very involved in participating and cooperating with the research. Almost all of them. Some of them didn't, but almost all of them did because they needed hope. And they needed hope for if it wasn't going to help them, it would help somebody else down the road. Very sacrificial in that way. But yes, the family. I always work with the family, not just with the individual affected.
All right. And Janet asks, is there anything we as individuals can do to prompt better understanding of mental health issues?
Well, I think to encourage people to read this book, and again, where mental illness is mental health issues. I always say people love to talk about mental illness. They just want to talk about somebody else's mental health, not their own. And I think with the pandemic, we've really been forced to look at our own mental health issues. And I think we just to break down that stigma, and it's just like any other illness. It's biologically based. So much of this is, yes, environment. It talks a lot in the book about nature versus nurture, the age-old question. And there's a lot of evidence here that is in the book that suggests there is an interactive quality to it. And why did some kids in that family, six of them have it, but six didn't, and why is that? And on and on and on. And so, but there is a lot of debate there that still goes on and trying to understand that. But I think that I would just encourage people to read, listen, learn, talk. Don't be afraid to talk about it. And we need to have these conversations like this out in the open so we can break down the stigma that still exists for mental health related issues.
Mhm. Yeah. And I'll just add, working in the library, we get a lot of folks who come in who obviously are dealing with some kind of mental illness. And I feel like, I try to, and I encourage my staff to be compassionate toward them. Their behavior can be scary or odd, but I feel like compassion goes a long way in making a situation better.
Calming ourselves,
Calming ourselves,
being kind. Yeah.
Not being judgmental.
Uh-oh.
Mm. We do have a comment, a great review of one of the best books that I've ever read. Thank you. And I will echo what she says. This is a very good book talk, although it was your first. You did a wonderful job.
Well,
I'm not seeing any more questions at the moment, and we are about out of time. Let's see. All right. Well, thank you so much, Michael. It was very wonderful to have you and to hear about this book. And I think I'm going to check it out now, having heard you discuss it, because I do think it sounds like a very important book. And the psychological community must owe a huge debt to this family. So thank you. And thank you to everyone who came out today. I did want to mention that next week on the 12th, we'll be joined by Sloan Davis, Assistant Professor of English at TCC, and she'll be discussing This Tender Land by William Kent Kruger. So thanks again, and I hope everyone has a wonderful day.
thank you.
thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.